Good morning. Thank you all for visiting with us again today. Welcome to Bible study with Andre and Betty. We're continuing our studies from the book of Daniel. Today we're in chapter 4, and we will be looking at Nebuchadnezzar and his testimony. We all have a testimony to let others know the encounters and the different experiences we've had in our lives. But Nebuchadnezzar is going to reveal to the people under his kingdom what happened to himself in his experiences with Daniel and the Hebrew people. So we begin today's study in chapter 4, and verse 1 says, Nebuchadnezzar the king, unto all people, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied unto you. Now he is the first world empire leader that rules over the nation Israel and the southern kingdom of Israel, and there has been no king of Israel since the beginning of his reign over the people, and there will be no king over the nation Israel until King Jesus returns and reigns over the kingdom during the millennial 1,000-year reign of Christ. And so Nebuchadnezzar the king is telling all people in all the earth his experience. He says in chapter 4, verse 2, I thought it good to show the signs and wonders that the high God hath wrought toward me, has allowed me to experience. And he calls the living God the high God. So he's coming into an understanding of who the living God really is. And he says in verse 3, how great are his signs and how mighty are his wonders, talking about the high God. His kingdom, God's kingdom, is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion or his kingdom or his rulership is from generation to generation. So throughout the ages, God had shown himself to be the ultimate ruler and Lord over his own creation. So Nebuchadnezzar goes on to explain in verse 4, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at rest in my house and flourishing in my palace. I saw a dream which made me afraid. So here he is with another dream and another vision. And the thoughts upon my bed and the visions of my head troubled me. Verse 6, therefore made I a decree to bring in all the wise men of Babylon before me, that they might make known unto me the interpretation of the dream. So this time, he's gonna tell his dream as before. He had just only a scant memory of what the dream was, but here he's going to reveal to the wise men the dream itself. And then verse 7, he says, then came in the magicians, the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. And I told the dream before them, but they did not make known unto me the interpretation thereof. So even before the magicians and astrologers asked him to tell the dream, and then they would interpret it, the dream. But in this case, even though he tells them the dream, they're still unable to interpret the dream. So verse 8 says, but at the last, after trying all of them, at the last Daniel came in before me, whose name was Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God, my idol God, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And before him I told the dream, saying, so even though he's coming into an apprehension of who the living God is, he's still a worshiper of his idol gods. But he recognizes that Daniel is filled with the Spirit of God, and that Daniel has the gift of interpretation of dreams. So he says to Daniel, but he calls him by his pagan name, O Belteshazzar, master of the magicians, because I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in thee, and no secret troubleth thee. Tell me the visions of my dream that I have seen, and the interpretation thereof. So he's petitioning Daniel to listen to his dream and then to interpret that dream. In verse 10, he's going to begin to tell what the tree vision meant. Now, in scripture, many times trees are symbols of mankind or kings or people in prominent positions. So this tree is going to symbolize King Nebuchadnezzar as monarch or ruler of the entire world. So verse 10, he says, thus were the visions of mine head in my bed. I saw, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and the height thereof was great. Verse 11, the tree grew and was strong, and the height thereof reached unto heaven, and the sight thereof to the end of all the earth. The leaves thereof, in verse 12, the leaves thereof of this tree were fair or beautiful, and the fruit thereof much. And in it, in the tree, was food or meat for all. The beasts of the field had shadow or shade under it, and the fowls of the heaven dwelt in the boughs thereof, and all flesh was fed of it. So that's a picture of him making food and necessities available to all of the people under his rulership. And he goes on in verse 13, this is Nebuchadnezzar telling all the people what happened to him. He says, I saw in the visions of my head upon my bed, and behold, a watcher and an holy one came down from heaven. So in my vision, I saw this watcher or this Holy One come down from heaven. And this watcher in verse 14, he cried aloud and said thus, this is what the watcher said, cut down the tree, or hew down the tree, and cut off his branches, shake off his leaves, and scatter his fruit. Let the beasts get away from under it, and the fowls from his branches. The fowls were not a part of the tree, but they lodged in the branches of the tree. And this watcher, who is the Holy One, an appearance of Jesus in the Old Testament, told them to get away from under it, and the fowls to get out of the branches of this tree. But the Holy One said in verse 15, nevertheless, leave the stump of his roots in the earth. And this stump is a symbolic of his life, even though he's cut down to size. This stump represents his life and his kingdom. So the Holy One said, nevertheless, leave the stump of his roots in the earth, even with a band of iron and brass, in the tender grass of the field. And let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beasts in the grass of the earth. So he's not going to be dwelling in a house or any type of tent. He's going to be living in the wilderness with the wild animals. And the watcher says in verse 16, let his heart be changed from man's, and let a beast's heart be given unto him, and let 7 times pass over him. Now the word times, time is 1 year, times is 2 years, and a time and a half is 3.5 years. So 7 times would equal 7 years. He says, but take a man's heart from him, that is the way mankind would feel, and give him an animal's heart, the instincts of an animal. Verse 17, this matter is by the decree of the watchers. Now is the watchers of the Godhead being over and above all that Nebuchadnezzar thinks he is. So it says this matter is by the decree of the watchers, and the demand by the word of the Holy Ones, Father, Son, and Spirit, to the intent that the living mankind may know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will, and set it up over it the basis of men. Nebuchadnezzar, you are an immoral man, and you have no heart for mankind except to have power over them. But I am the reason, God says, that you have this position. And the Most High God is El Elyon, which means he's possessor of heaven and earth. And so he's saying to the watchers of the Holy Ones are saying to this king, I am the reason that you're in this position. So verse 18, Nebuchadnezzar says, this dream I, King Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now thou, O Belteshazzar, or Daniel, declare the interpretation thereof, for as much as all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make known unto me the interpretation. But thou art able, for the spirit of the holy gods is in thee. So now he's finished telling his dream to Daniel, and he's now asking him to interpret the dream for him. Now, Daniel is going to begin to interpret the dream to King Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 19. Then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was astonished for 1 hour, and his thoughts troubled him. It was a terrifying dream to Daniel to see the interpretation before he tells the dream. And then he lets the king see that the dream is troubling. So the king spake and said, Belteshazzar, let not the dream or the interpretation thereof trouble thee. Belteshazzar answered and said, My Lord, the dream be to them that hate thee. I wish this dream was for your enemies, not you, O king. The dream, my Lord, the dream be to them that hate thee, and the interpretation thereof to thine enemies. Daniel did not want to see the fulfillment of this vision that Nebuchadnezzar was telling him about. So now in verse 20, he's going to start letting him know what the vision meant. The tree that thou sawest, which grew and was strong, whose height reached unto the heaven, and the sight thereof to all the earth, whose leaves were fair, and the fruit thereof much, and in it was meat for all, under which the beasts of the field dwelt, and upon whose branches the fowls of the heaven had their habitation. It is you, O king, the tree is you. It is thou, O king, that are grown and become strong. For thy greatness is grown and reacheth unto heaven, and thy dominion to the end of the earth. You are the ruler of the entire populated earth. Verse 23. And whereas the king saw a watcher and an holy one come down from heaven and saying, Hew the tree down and destroy it, yet leave the stump of the roots thereof in the earth, even with a band of iron and brass in the tender grass of the field, and let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion, the king's portion, be with the beast of the field till 7 times, or 7 years pass over him. His portion would be all that he needed to continue to live as a stump in the wilderness with an animal's heart. So, verse 24 says, Daniel says, This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High, which is come upon my Lord the king, that the they is the Godhead, that they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and they shall wet thee with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over thee, until you know, O king, that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. So under the demand and decree of the Godhead, Nebuchadnezzar is brought to this position of animal-like behavior. In verse 26, and whereas the Godhead commanded to leave the stump of the tree roots, that represents thy kingdom shall be given to you again, shall be sure unto thee, but only after that thou shalt have known that the heavens do rule. You are in a designated position, but know, O king, that the heavens, the Godhead, is the ruler of his own creation. And Daniel goes on to say, wherefore, O king, in verse 27, let my counsel be acceptable unto thee, and break off thy sins by righteousness. Stop doing what you're doing, and thine iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, if it may be a lengthening of thy tranquility. So in other words, if you want to have your senses and your being back, then turn from your idols unto the living God, and then pay special attention to the poor who are under your rulership. And then it may be a lengthening of thy sanity or thy tranquility. Verse 28, this is where the dream is going to be fulfilled. Nebuchadnezzar speaks again in verse 28. He says, all this came upon the king Nebuchadnezzar, and at the end of 12 months, a year, Nebuchadnezzar, this is at the end of the 7 years, in 12 months later, Nebuchadnezzar walked in the palace of the kingdom of Babylon. The king spake and said, is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty? While the word was in the king's mouth, as he was speaking, there fell a voice from heaven saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee, and they, that is the Godhead, shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. They shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and 7 times shall pass over thee, until thou knowest that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. So after Daniel interpreted the dream and the vision, Nebuchadnezzar is so filled with pride that a year after Daniel interpreted the dream, he's going to try God to see if what Daniel has interpreted is coming true. And here it has come true. So verse 33 says, the same hour was the thing fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar, and he was driven from men and did eat grass as oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hairs were grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like bird claws. So what a pitiful sight to see a man with are the hairs of his skin like eagle's feathers, and his nails as claws of a bird. Verse 34. And at the end of the days, now this is the actual end of the 7 years, Nebuchadnezzar says in verse 34, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes unto heaven, and mine understanding returned unto me. And what did I do? And I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him that liveth forever and ever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. Verse 35, and all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. And he doeth, that is the Most High God, doeth according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. And none can stay his hand or stop him or say unto him, what doest thou? At the same time, when I repented and I understood that the Most High ruled in the kingdom of men, verse 36, at the same time, my reason returned unto me. This is the stump that was left and the dew fell upon it. At the same time, my reason returned unto me, and for the glory of my kingdom, mine honor and brightness returned unto me. And my counselors and my lords sought unto me, and I was established in my kingdom, and excellent majesty was added unto me. This is what he had seen in the vision, and it's now coming true. Now this is the last words of his testimony. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth and his ways judgment. And those that walk in pride, he is able to abase, or he's able to humble. And so Nebuchadnezzar, at the end of his rulership and his days and his kingdom, is humbled by his experiences with Daniel and the Hebrew people who were under his leadership or rulership. There is something for a person to have been so immoral and so indignant toward other people to come to the realization that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and he's the ruler of the entire heaven and the earth. So when men get lifted up in pride, it takes God to bring them down to their level and let them know that it's better to humble thyself than for God to humble you by taking you through the experiences that this man had for 7 years. So there is so much going on in the world today where people think that and act like they're God, and they have no concern about how they're treating other people. The book of Hebrews says it's a dangerous thing to fall into the hand of the living God. So we pray that they repent as Nebuchadnezzar repented. And Nebuchadnezzar has one of the greatest testimonies in the Bible about who the living God is. And so this concludes our study for today, and we will pick up again next week in chapter 5. So thank you all for listening, and you all have a blessed day. Remember, my email address is bjt1125@yahoo.com. It's a blessing to be with you each week, and thank you all for your support. Keep Andre and me in your prayers, and you're in ours. Have a great day. Bye.